Okay, my name is Etienne Wenger. So here at the University of Manchester, I'm a visiting professor, but more generally in life, I'm an independent author and researcher and consultant, and more specifically, you could call me a social learning theorist, in the sense that I'm interested in theories of learning that deal with the social aspects of learning, as opposed to simply the cognitive or biological aspects of learning. Welcome. It's my pleasure to be here and to be talking to you. The title of this lecture is Learning for a Small Planet, Perspective from Social Learning Theory. And the idea of this title is to ask the teacher to think about the students they're going to engage with in their life as citizens of this planet, and ask them to reflect on what does it mean to educate world citizens who become learning citizens in the world. I'm not going to sort of give you a formal run through the kind of learning theory that I've been working with, because you can do that by reading my books. It's a chance to be here live and to exchange our views. I'm going to invite you a little bit into the kind of thinking I do, and then ask you to invite me into your thinking, so that we can see whether there is, some relevance there. So I'm going to start very autobiographically, describing why I came to be interested in this topic. I have found that it is a good way for people to understand what it is. Then I'm going to give them a sense of what the theory is about. What are the main concepts and the main perspective of the theory? And then engage them in reflecting on themselves to think about what that might mean for the way that they would act as teachers. So I'm going to tell them how I started myself as a teacher, and then became interested in research, and started my life as a cognitive science researcher, focusing more on computer models of learning, and then slowly became more interested in social perspective on learning that have to do with how learning is a way of becoming someone in the world, and not simply acquiring information or skills. I was a teacher of French as a second language, and both in Hong Kong and in a school in Denver, and felt that really for those kids in Denver, learning French was kind of like not obviously useful for their life. So I went back to university and started to study computer science, because I thought there would be something relevant to young kids. Soon, I became interested in not just computer science as a topic to teach, but computers as a tool for teaching. So I became interested in what at the time was called computer-based training, went to a university in Southern California to do a PhD on that, and became interested in applications of artificial intelligence and tutoring systems. At that time, the idea was that, hey, we have these computers. The brain is obviously a computer too. Why don't we use the computers to create models of the students? And perhaps the teaching programs that we design could follow a model of the students' learning and then correct mistakes. Okay, so you could follow a student doing a little piece of programming, and if the student made a mistake, you try to say, why did student make a mistake? What kind of wrong algorithm does the student have in his or her head, and can we correct that? Those were the kind of ambitions we had at the time. I think the field has changed a lot. I think we almost abandoned that ambition of simulating a teacher. But at the time, I was always a little bit disturbed by the fact that in these models we were building of the student, we always had to push out the question of, what does this mean? What does this learning mean? So we were dealing with construction of algorithm, constructions of information structures, if you will. But the question of meaning was always relegated to, okay, what is math? Why would you want to learn math? Or why would you want to learn programming? What does it mean to you in your life? All these questions, which to me kind of were essential to learning, we had to push them out of the model, hope that somewhere else, a little bit like if you're if a computer sends you a paycheck or something like this. You see what I mean? For you, it has a lot of meaning. This is the work I've done. This is the money I've received. But for the computer that does the printing, it's kind of like, even if it does it right to the cent, a meaningless task. After I wrote my first book, I was invited to join an institute in California. The idea of this institute was the schools of education are going to study classroom learning and do all sorts of experiments on new ways to do classroom learning. Some people ought to ask the question of what is learning? What assumptions are we making about learning? And basically, our task as a research institute was to rethink learning. They had brought together people from different disciplines to do that. So I was coming from computer science, but there were people coming from linguistics, there were people coming from anthropology, from psychology, from education. And it was very interesting to see that the question of how to rethink learning among those disciplines very quickly came to a question of what assumptions are you making about what a learner is? And of course, from computer science, the assumption was a learner is an information processor. Obviously, the brain is an information processing machine. So a learning is an information processor. You give that learner the right data, and that learner will construct the knowledge that you wanted. And the anthropologist was like, this is absurd. This is totally uninteresting to me. Because for me, a learner is a person who is becoming a member of a society, and they are trying to understand what the society is about, what the rituals of that society is about. I mean, you can imagine the anthropologist kind of looking at learning on an island or something like this. And so very quickly, the question of what is learning and how to have an account of learning came down to what assumptions are you making about the nature of the learner. And it was interesting for me, I was a graduate student at the time, to see how that debate became intense. How these professors who had joined this institute to do that research felt threatened by someone who was questioning their assumptions about the world and the value of the research and so on and so forth. At the time, to me, it was a kind of a lesson in seeing how, even for these professors, their identity was really involved in their own work, and just simply questioning the assumption of like, well, maybe this is good programming, what you're doing, but it's not relevant to me. Or, well, but your description of your tribe and is nice literature, but it's not science because you cannot reproduce the behavior, you know? How these questions were perceived as really threatening by these, well-established professors. For me, as a graduate student, it was a really interesting experience, and in some sense was a foreshadowing the kind of theory that was to come out of that process. So the next section will cover the theory itself. So I'm going to try to explain to them what is a social perspective on learning. They may not be very familiar with that because mostly learning theories are focused on the cognitive aspects of learning as opposed to the social aspects. So I'm going to, in a second section, give them a sense of how concepts like social practice, social communities, where those practices belong, a notion of identity as a relationship between the person and social communities, how these concepts actually form a perspective on learning that may be relevant to their work. I started to work with an anthropologist. She had done a lot of work in apprenticeship in Africa among tailors. And so we started to look at apprenticeship as a form of learning. And one of the reasons we started to focus on apprenticeship as a mode of learning was because we wanted to separate learning from teaching. We didn't want to think that learning was the consequence of teaching. We wanted to see how does learning take place in and of itself in a context in which the thing that a person is learning is directly relevant to who they are becoming. Okay? So for us, it was interesting to look at apprenticeship because we wanted to say, okay, how do we think of learning outside of a schooling process? And apprenticeship was an age-old learning system where knowledge had not been separated into a curriculum, but was part of becoming a tailor. So if you were an apprentice tailor in Africa, you started by running errands for your community. So the first thing you did is to kind of understand in this community, what do people need? Where do they send me to buy stuff? And then you saw the buttons all the way back to cutting the fabric. It was the last thing that you did as an apprentice. So it was interesting to see how the curriculum for those students was a series of activities that was the inverse of the production process as a way to allow them to understand what the practice was about. And so this term community of practice, with which my name is associated because I've written a lot about it, started simply as an effort to give a name to this living curriculum that we're observing in these cases of apprenticeship. And the reason we focused on the notion of a community was that apprenticeship is often thought of as a relationship between a master and a student, but in fact, in these cases that we were observing in the world, there was a whole community. And as an apprentice, you were basically finding your way into that community. At the beginning, not interacting with the master very much. There was kind of a distant figure, interacting much more with other apprentices at kind of your level, and then moving in, and at some point, becoming a master tailor yourself. And so that term, community of practice, was at first simply a way to talk about that living curriculum that existed in the community. But what was interesting is that once we had that concept of a community of practice, then we started seeing that process of learning in all sorts of circumstances where there was no formal institution of apprenticeship. We started seeing it even in schools with kids on the playground, learning different ways of being a kid, being a person, being a student in an institution, depending on which friendship group you belong to. You would learn very, very different things about the institution, about your relationship with the institution, experience of marginality, experiences of playing the game of the institution, and so on and so forth. She was even observing that you were learning different things about who you are as a person.